So viewChild is important. There also is viewChildren if you wanted to select multiple elements. For example, if I had multiple custom buttons in that template, we could use viewChildren with the button component like this to in the end store an array of buttons in this property here, or an array of element refs that will resolve to my button component instances, to be precise. So viewChildren is an important variation of viewChild, you could say, in case you need to select multiple viewChild items. Another important variation is that besides using it like this, you can also use viewChild as a function. So you could add a potentially private form property here, and we could have marked this here as private as well. Let's maybe do that. But instead of doing that, we could also create the property like this without the viewChild decorator, and instead call viewChild as a function. And for that, you must import the viewChild function from @Angular core. Now, the viewChild function is a relatively new feature. It's only been available since Angular 17.3, and it's not available in older Angular versions. And viewChild will actually give you a signal as a value. So it's a signal-related feature. Now, it generally works like the decorator, though. You pass a selector to viewChild, like the button component class name, if you wanted to select a button in your template, a custom button component occurrence in your template, or a string with a template variable name if you want to select an element by template variable. So that would then give us hold of a signal that in the end resolves to our HTML form element. Though, as you can see if you hover over form, Angular doesn't know that. It just knows that it will be a signal with an unknown value, and therefore, just as with viewChild up here, you also have to give Angular, or specifically TypeScript, some extra type information here. And you should let TypeScript know which kind of value will be stored in form here, or will be stored in that signal here in the end. And you do that by adding angle brackets again, because viewChild is again such a generic type which creates a signal that works together with other type values, the types of the value stored in it, to be precise. And the type of value stored in that signal will again be an element ref object, which then internally stores such a HTML form element. And with that, you can then use this form and execute it as a function, because it's a signal, and then access native element reset. Now, as you can see, I'm getting an error here, though, that the object is possibly undefined. Because indeed, if you hover over this form property, you can see that the signal that is produced by Angular here will give us such an element ref, which then internally holds this form element object, but alternatively, it could also give us undefined if it fails to find that element somewhere in the template. Now what we can do again is use this question mark here to tell TypeScript and Angular and JavaScript in the end that we only want to execute all this code if this form signal does hold such an element ref object. Alternatively, there also is an alternative version of that viewChild function which you could use. And that's the required function. So on the viewChild function, you access the required function, or the required method actually, which also selects an element in the template with help of that selector, but which, unlike viewChild without required, guarantees that an element will be found. And therefore, of course, you must make sure that you do have a selector here that will yield an element, so that you don't use a selector here that wouldn't produce an element, like forms. Then you would run into issues. So that's something you have to check for. But here with form, I know that this form will always exist and that it can be found in the template, and therefore I can use this required version of the viewChild function so that Angular and TypeScript in the end knows that this form property will always hold a signal that will always produce such an element ref that will hold the form element object. And that's then that signal way of resetting that form with help of that viewChild function, which besides giving us a signal also allows us to avoid this viewChild decorator. And if you're not a fan of decorators, that therefore might be another reason for using that function instead. But as mentioned, it's only available if you're using Angular 17.3 or newer. With that, however, if I enter something here and I submit this, you see the form is reset again. And of course, it's also worth noting that besides this viewChild function, there also is a viewChildren function in case you needed to select multiple elements in your template. We don't need that here though. So you learned about viewChild and viewChildren, both the decorator version and this function version. There also are a related decorator and a related function that can also sometimes come in handy. And for that, I'll go to that control component that we created earlier. In there, I'm using ngContent to output any input or text area elements that are wrapped by this control component. Now, what if you wanted to get hold of those input or text area elements inside of your control component class? Well, you can't use viewChild for that, because if you're using ngContent for projecting content into this template, the projected content is not actually part of the template. And viewChild and the viewChildren only allows you to select content that is part of the template. So, put in other words, where the code is in that template, not the placeholder for it, as it's the case here. But Angular gives you a way of getting hold of that projected content with help of the content child or content children decorators, or the content child and content children functions. And I'll start with the decorator content child. It essentially works like the viewChild decorator. You put it in front of a property that can be marked as private, but that's not required. And you can give that property any name of your choice. And here I'll simply name it control, but it is up to you as mentioned. Now, just as viewChild, content child now needs a selector to find the content element that should be selected and stored in control here. And just as before, you could use a component class name or a directive class name here, or you could use a template variable, for example, input. Now I'll set the type of control in just a second. First, I want to make sure that this input variable exists in some template. Now the template we want to manipulate and to which we want to add that template variable is not this control component template, because in here we just have the placeholder for the eventually projected content. So instead we have to go to the place where those elements are indeed set up, which is the new ticket component HTML file in my case. Here I'm passing input and text area into app control, which is that component where I just added content child. Well, and it's now here where we can add input as a variable name to the input and the text area elements. And you can use the same template variable name twice, as you see here, and you can also add multiple template variables to those elements, as you can see. But with that, I'm adding this input variable here, And back in the control component TypeScript file, I'm selecting projected content by looking for that template variable named input. And therefore, I know that control in this app control component will then be an element ref. So that should be used as a type here and should be imported from @AngularCore. And eventually, in that element ref, I'll get hold of an HTML input element or an HTML text area element. Because I know that both kinds of elements can be projected into this control component. Now I'm using content child instead of content children here, even though multiple elements have that input variable, because in each instance of my control component, there will only be one input or text area. I'm only passing one input or text area element per app control component instance. That's why inside that control component, it's content child, not content children. Now, just as before, control could be undefined if nothing's found. But with that, we can then console log this control, for example, whenever the control is clicked. Well, and with that, you should see that if I click on that input here, the element ref is output, and you see in the native element, I got this input element. If, on the other hand, I click on that text area, you see the selected element is that text area element, that text area DOM object. And that's how you could get hold of projected content instead of elements that are defined right inside of that template. Now, just as with viewchild, there also is a function and signal alternative if you're using Angular 17.3 or later, because you can also set up this control property by using the content child function or content children if you would try to select multiple projected elements. Now again, you must pass your selector, in this case the template variable name, to content child. And you should add this extra type annotation with angle brackets and make it clear that in there we'll get an element ref, which then will actually refer or hold an input element or a text area element. So that's how you can tell TypeScript which kind of value will eventually end up in this control signal. And since it is a signal, you also must execute control as a function down there to read that signal value. With that, if you reload, if you click on the title input, you output that element ref that refers to that title input. And if you click on the request text area, you get that object in your element ref. So that's working the way it should, now with this alternative content child function.